Hello, we are into engineering economics, so we are into part 2. So we're going to cover slightly more advanced topics and how actual companies make determinations about go, no-go decisions on power plants. And I was just speaking to somebody who works for Eversource in Western Mass and talking about some of the distributed generation and how they spend so much money to the point where they're replacing, very large transformers, and then they still decide to go ahead and put renewable energy projects in. So pretty remarkable, but we'll look at this in terms of more generic stuff and not based on some political stuff. So here's our outline. We're going to look at our return on investment, an IRR calculation, which is a nonlinear sort of guess and check way, or you can do some some table lookup. We have both of those. We'll look at infinite horizon cash flow, so that's that perpetuity concept. Now we're going to get into a topic that everybody should be important to, which is inflation, the effects of inflation, and then also fuel escalation, so the effect of cost of fuel increasing. Our capital recovery factor, which we've kind of talked about back and forth a couple of times, and we'll get back into that again. Our levelized bus bar costs, so if you're a utility or a generating company, and you work in the electrical world, typically what you talk about is a bus as an electrical interconnection point. So it's an electrical bus, and the bus bar is the actual production of kilowatt hours as they are put out onto the grid. So this is actual kilowatt hour costs, including all the fuel costs and efficiencies and other costs. And then the last thing, and this is new for this year, which is NREL has something called the System Advisor Model, which is a free download. So we briefly talk about it. It's not intended to get into specifics, but essentially it's a financial analysis package that also includes some resource determinations to help you make some decisions about putting in a renewable energy project. So let's start off with our return on investment. So if we want to invest $5,000, and after 20 years, we want to sell that investment for $13,000. What we want to do is to figure out what that APR is equal to. And there's two ways of doing it. There's one way is just doing it without reinvesting, so taking that $5,000 that we have here and not continuing to invest it. Or we can reinvest it, which now includes the fact that we're getting interest on our interest. And so then we basically have to add our 1 plus R calculation there. So you'll notice if you reinvest, your interest rate is far lower, 4.9% as compared to 8%. So is this a great investment? Well, it's only getting a 5% return when you compare it to traditional investments, so not necessarily a great return if you include reinvestment. So here is the concept of equivalency with the reinvestment. So here's our cash flow diagram with a $5,000 outlay at the beginning of the period. And then after 20 years, our investment is going to be $13,000. Our net present value, which is, again, comparing the two options. Would I take $5,000 today? Or would I take $13,000 in the future? That is a zero-sum game with an interest rate of 4.9%. So the net present value here is 0. So either one of those is equivalent, right? It doesn't make a difference if you pick option A or option B, provided your analysis is done assuming that you can get 4.9%. You will be without your money for 20 years, but the thought is that you're okay with that because you're getting 4.9% on that. So what if you don't know necessarily what an investment is going to be worth in the future or today, or what if you're not exactly sure what interest rate? So you can make a decision about an investment based on what's called internal rate of return, and that's going to be based not only on just a present or a future value, but it's also going to include the concept of our annuities. So having some money that comes in every period, every specific pay period. So we're going to start off with our present value function using our annuity approach. And if you remember beta, if you can't remember from the previous slides, it's 1 minus d, or 1 minus r, to the minus 1 power is our beta value. And the value of d that we specify here, that makes its present value 0, right? So it makes the annuity, the cash you're getting every month or every year, whatever you work it out to be, whatever cash amount that you get based on an investment, so that you get a net sum of 0 is what your internal rate of return is going to be equal to. All right? So essentially it tells you what interest rate you're going to get so that you're getting your money back on an investment. It's an iterative process because the equation is a non-linear equation. So what we're doing is we're solving this particular function here, right? This is the function we're trying to solve for when we set our present value function equal essentially to 0. So this is the table that's in your book. And the way that you use this table is you start off by looking at your life column. So how long your life is expected to last. Is it 1 year? Is it 10 years? 20 years, etc. Then you're going to do a calculation for this present value function. So you're going to take your p and divide it by a and come up with a number. That's going to equal to some number. So let's just say the life is 10. You're going to look in this row, and wherever the number is closest to that value, 5.89, 5.43, whatever, when you're closest to that value, it tells you what your internal rate of return is going to be for that specific investment. Okay? So here's an example. $30,000 outlay nets me 8 periods at $6,000 each. So I'd like to determine the internal rate of return. So you set up your present value function, setting it equal to 0. So this is actually what I spent, $30,000. That's my negative 30. I'm getting $6,000 per annum. Now I need to figure out so that the difference between what I outlay versus what my annuity values are going to be with my interest rate sets that equal to 0. So essentially what you have is my p value function is going to be equal to 30k divided by 6k, which is equal to 5. So if I did that for a period of 8 years, so my time period is 8 years here, and my present value function is 5, I go up to this table, and now I'm going to highlight where my years are 5, and now I need to look in this column. Oh, I'm sorry, I said 8, not 5. Try that again. So I'm looking at 8, and this is the years this is the row that I'm looking at based on a life of 8 years. So the closest present value function that will give me a reasonable result is the correct IRR. So we said that our PVF is supposed to be 5. So you can see that in this range, right, is what the IRR is. Because 5 is between 5.15 and 4.8. So at approximately someplace in the middle, and if you look at the results, it's 12%. That's the approach you'll take. So if you use the table, you start off with your first column, gives you the year, then you highlight the row corresponding to that column with the year, and then you basically divide your present value, or whatever your expenditure is, by the annuity amount that you're going to get, and then you calculate or you obtain that value of D. Another way to do it is always do a plot, right? So this is a plot of 6% or $6,000, and I just allow the interest rate to go up to whatever value. I just plotted it between 1% and 16%, so just as a brute force method. So if my interest rate starts out at 16%, right, and I want to bring that amount back, I'm only going to get $27,000. If my interest rate is 1%, I'm going to get over $47,000. So the interest rate should correspond to right when that line crosses a present value of $30,000. Okay? So, whoops. Not sure why that keeps toggling. So 12% gives you $30,000. So if you're ever stuck and you have the ability to plot it, you can just plot it that way. You don't need to look up the table, and you can calculate it that way. This is just a brute force. Just apply a number of percentages, just literally plug in I of whatever value, and then just keep chunking it through until eventually you get a reasonable result. That's what this plot is representative of. So let's take a look at a replacement refrigerator. So a new refrigerator, if you decide to replace your existing one, will cost you an additional $1,000, but it will save you $200 per year over the existing model you have. If you have a lifetime of 10 years, that's how long the refrigerator is expected to last, which is pretty close to what most appliances in the 5 to 10 year period is what, if you ask the major manufacturers what typical appliance life expectancies are, I don't think anybody wants anything to last more than 10 years. And if you look at the technology, you can see why, because it changes so quickly. But about 10 years. So this calculation becomes, 1,000 divided by 200, which is equal to 5. So again, I have another value of 5, but what's different now is my lifetime. My lifetime is 10 years, not 8 years. So I'm going to go back up to my table, and I apologize for continuing to scroll back and forth, but with this technology, it doesn't work well. I'm going to look at my 5-year period, and I'll highlight that in a different color. Here's 5 years. 10 years. Sorry. I keep focusing on 5, and I meant to say 10. Not sure why that line moved there. That's interesting. So here's my 10. And I'm going to look at where it's closest to 5, and you can see it's approximately 15% would be my interest rate for a 10-year return. So this has an effective interest rate, the solution of about 15, okay? So your IRR in this case is approximately 15%. All right, that's by looking up the table. Again, you can go ahead and do the brute force calculation if you want, but the table usually does a reasonably good job, and you can use linear interpolation between points if you so choose. Okay? So that's what's summarized there, 15%. If you assume that the refrigerator is going to last for 15 years, you can take a look. So if it's 15 years, then our discount rate is 18.5. What would it be if the refrigerator never dies? What would be your interest rate? 100?
Betas go to 0, so it's 1 over D is 5.
1 over D is 5?
So D is 0.2 or
20%,
20%.
very good. You can also look at it intuitively, right? Said, if I invest $1,000 and I get $200 every year, $1,000 gets me 200, 20%, right? 20% of 1,000 is $200. So just intuitively, you can say, if I invest $1,000 and I always get $20, that gives me an interest rate of 20%, right? Because I'm getting 20% on my money year after year after year. That's without reinvestment, but that's the idea. So you're right, you can plug in the beta, because again, if you assume infinity, beta to the infinity, right, goes away. So then you're just left with that 1 minus D, so you end up with 20%. But I like the intuitive way, which is, hey, if I get $1,000 and I get back 200, and that never goes away, then that's a 20% rate of return. Okay, so now we're on to what's called an infinite horizon cash flow, sort of expanding upon that it never goes away, right? So if it lasts forever. So as the gentleman here spoke of earlier, as our n approaches infinity, our beta terms here, right? The beta of the n, this term is going to drop out, and this term is going to be 1, so we end up with A over D. So our discount rate becomes just simply A over P, and in our example, 200 divided by 1,000 is 20%, right? Just by assuming that and allowing n to approach infinity, okay? You're essentially doing a limit function at that point, okay? So D is our capital recovery factor we talked about a little bit, but it becomes more of a fixed charge rate when we include the fact that it's always going to have to be, instead of getting money back, we're actually continuing to put money into a particular project to maintain it. So we're always paying that 20% every year to pay off our renewable energy project. So that's kind of how all this stuff operates out from our capital recovery factor or our fixed charge rate. And so this is just formalizing our discussion. If your initial value is 1,000, your annuity is 200, and it's a 20%, that is going to be a simple payback of 5 years, right? So that's not including reinvestment. Okay, so now this is what makes a lot of the financial analysis a lot more complicated. It's not enough to say you're getting interest on something, because your effective rate of interest is not what you perceive it to be, okay? So if you think you're getting a 2% return on your money, yes, technically, but in reality, its worth is different, and it's all based on inflation. So inflation essentially tells you the price of something today is going to be less than the price of something tomorrow. The cost of goods and services are going to continue to go up, which means the value of a dollar decreases over time. Now, that's the general rule of thumb. There are instances where you have things such as deflation, but that is pretty rare that you actually have a deflating economy. And it's a question whether a deflating economy is worse than a inflating economy that's inflating at a too rapid rate. Now, what's happening in Venezuela, if those of you have paid attention, that's called hyperinflation. That's completely different. That's when government may fall, humanitarian crises. That's a completely different thing that we can't even really talk about, because I don't know the political. I mean, at that point, everybody's in survival mode, so it's a very different experience for hyperinflation. But if we're not in hyperinflation, and hyperinflation, I don't know what its categories, but it must be greater than 1,000% per annum. I mean, just, you can't buy anything, or you don't have money, because if somebody gives you $100, it might be worth 10 cents tomorrow. So the the actual denomination of money is there, it just doesn't have any value. So at that point, it's goods and services, right? It's food, it's vehicles, it's more of a bartering system almost, is how that you kind of deal with that. So again, it's a completely different thing. But in the U.S., we've had a fairly stable economy, mainly inflation. And if you take a look, the U.S. came up with a concept in the early 80s called the Consumer Price Index. And this is modified now because this data has gotten easier to get and easier to analyze. There's consumer price indices for all kinds of different ones. You can actually take a look at the Consumer Price the Consumer Price Index website, and you can actually see how they have it for energy and cars and I don't know, there must be 50 different categories. I still like to use this CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index. So this is what the average consumer would perhaps purchase. So this is based on a market basket of goods: a gallon of milk, a loaf of bread, a dozen eggs, something along those lines, which would be considered staples that, on average, the average American family, whatever that looks like, would actually purchase. So they came up with a standard in the early 80s of a 3-year average, the 82 to 84 average, and they said, we're going to make that basket of goods worth to be $100. So everything that we put in this basket in that time period, you can purchase for about $100. Today, that basket of goods is actually going to cost you $257. So to buy the same exact basket of goods, you now have to shell out 2.5 times more money to get that. That may be okay as long as your wages are going up by that amount. Are wages going up? They were for a while, but I think in the 90s that started to change, and so you're seeing the cost of goods and services going up greater than what the salaries are. So what people do is they work more hours or they work more jobs, right? Which essentially means work more hours. I like this figure because it goes back a little further. It goes back almost 100 years, right? Oh, over 100 years. So if you think about inflation, best way to look at it is a dollar bill. So if you start out in 1913 and you figure out what $100 was worth, you can see an image or a portion of Ben Franklin's face there, but it's been chewed away by inflation, right? So in 1913, $100 was worth something. And then you could see some of the major implications of either local U.S. Policies or worldwide impacts. So if you look at some of the big ones here, right? In the 20s, right? The Wall Street crash. I don't know what Bretton Woods, that might have been the New Hampshire where they came up with monetary policy. Oil crisis in the 70s, and you can see how you had some pretty big dips. Second oil crisis, and then things started to stabilize out a little bit, mainly because the value of a dollar is so small, you can't even tell at this point what's going on. But another major one was happening in this time frame here. And it's indicated as kind of a small footnote, but in 2008, most people remember it, when Lehman Brothers collapsed, that was a major issue that financial markets worldwide were not going to be able to sustain it. And there was a lot of work done to do or to fix some of the issues that were occurring because of that. And so now there are bank tests to kind of limit that, but that was a major deal. And then you can even see with Trump tax cuts, that's been a policy implication. And then we've had the longest U.S. expansion. And U.S. expansion essentially implies that we've had continuous growth. We've not had 2 consecutive quarters of our GDP decreasing. So that's considered an expansion. So this is the longest U.S. expansion in history. And there's been a lot of things that have played into that. I am not an economist, but if you were to ask them, I think the Fed has helped with that. The tax cuts have helped with that. There's been a lot of reasons why that has actually happened, but I don't purport to know all the answers. But it seems like things are still going good. Last time I checked, the stock market is almost at its all-time high again. So, depending on your perspective. I feel bad for college students because as you're graduating out, right, it's been 10 years of growth, and there's a downturn likely to come, right? So it tends to be pretty severe for about a year, but you haven't enjoyed that 10 or so plus years of sustained economic growth. So you're going to be graduating and starting to invest in your 401ks just when the market might actually start going down, which is not to discourage you not to do it. You still need to do it because you'll do dollar cost averaging, but it's something to think about in terms of, it's just timing. It really is. It's just the timing of things. So something to think about. So here it talks a little bit about our average CPI and then this change in the average CPI. So you can see that the blue line is riding up, and it shows you how this is the consumer price index is going from starting out at the benchmark of 100 from 1982 to 84 average. So you can see this is right at 100, and then continue to shoot up, right, to now that it's getting to be $257. But look at the variability in the consumer price index. So in the last 30 to so years, we've been fairly stable, right? We've been fairly stable, which is a good thing, meaning that the price in goods and services have not gone up. Like when you see price jumps like this or this, right? And these price jumps are on the right axis here. You can see that that is a real, that's pretty dramatic in terms of the change, and that really forces people to sort of step back to figure out how they're going to live their lives. But when you don't have a big change from 5% less than 5%, and as long as it continues to go up, it's okay. Remember in 2008, we had a pretty big deal. You will notice that it did drop below 0%. So we had deflation occurring. The cost of goods and services got cheaper. Not by much, but they did get cheaper. But if you would look at this line, and you could draw a straight line, there hasn't been many times when you've had deflation. A few, but usually it's a major economic issue. One other thing that I showed you here is how to actually do the calculation. So I just pulled this data. So this is the average of the 3 years, and then I started at 1984, and then I went to September 2019, which was the basket of goods. I put that over here, and then I just solved for my inflation rate by using the 1 plus I or R or whatever you want, raised to the n power. So this is our formula that we've been using for the last couple classes, 1 plus I to the n, so you're just going to solve for I. So I just solved that to get what we've averaged for inflation for the past 30 plus years, which is about 2.65%. Before that, the data is a little sketchy because that market basket of goods may not have been as consistent. The other thing too is now the CPI also does it by cities. They actually have consumer price index by cities, and so they're getting a lot of really interesting information. So now we have inflation. How do we manage it? How do we deal with it? Well, if we have an annuity, right, that is here or here, what's the difference? Well, one includes the effect of inflation, and one is going to ignore the effect of inflation. This one is, the W is inflation-free, and this is assuming inflation. So if your money is trying to keep up with inflation, you have to include that 2.65%. So if you recall from the last class when I said, most people are hoping to get 8% rate of return on their investments in retirement, well, you better subtract from that 2.65% because that's what inflation is eating into. So just because your money is worth 8% more, it actually is only worth, let's see, that's 5.35% more is what your real rate of return is going to be, okay? So that's why you need to be targeting to get a minimum, well, I don't know what a minimum is, but some people will tell you a minimum of 8%. Some people will tell you a higher rate of return than 8% because effectively you're only going to be getting 5.35% rate of return, okay? And then they also talk about withdrawal rates. One of the numbers that's being thrown around is 4%. You don't want to exceed 4% or above that. Otherwise, you might outlive your money if you take it out for retirement. So that's partially including this effect of inflation because as you start to take 4%, you're getting that money, but this 2.65% is greater than the 4%. So conventionally, you're always going to be beating your inflation, and your costs don't vary all that much when you retire. I mean, it's up to you. Obviously, you buy new cars and stuff, but for the most part, people think when they retire, they're going to save a lot of money. They say it's something like 80%. You spend 80% what your pre-retirement income level was, and that is pretty stationary as you go through. So as long as you have enough to cover that 80% before you retired, and you don't take out more than 4% of your money, you should be able to outlive your money. So just some rule of thumb numbers. And again, these aren't hard and fast numbers, and I'm not a financial advisor, and I'm not intending to be 100%. This is just general advice. I'm not telling you to buy any particular stocks and bonds. I'm not putting anything down. These are just things to think about in terms of your own, like how can you get this information and use it personally. So if I want to go back and forth between inflated and non-inflated, I'm going to use E, which is my rate of inflation, okay? So all I need to do is add that to go back and forth between my inflated dollars and my non-inflated dollars. So let's take a look at something where I don't inflate it, and let's say I'm going to get $1,000 for the next 3 years. And I want to compare that to, well, great, I'm getting $1,000 for the next 3 years. How does that compare with the effect of inflation? Well, if I'm going to inflate at a 4% inflation rate here, then I should be getting almost $1,125 to get the same or comparable amount of purchasing power as $1,000 today, based on the fact that I've got to be able to have that inflation, include the effect of inflation. So what we'd like to do now is we'd like to sort of figure out how we can include or incorporate that effective inflation rate. So we're going to modify things, and we're going to actually use the term escalation, because that's going to escalate our costs. So inflation is not always a term that is synonymous in business. Sometimes you actually see escalation, right? Because it's fuel escalation. What is fuel inflation? That's not really a term that you would find. So he'll start off with our present value function, and this is just defined many, many different times. I also included on here, if you wanted to look in Excel, you can incorporate or go directly into the insert function in Excel, and you can insert equations, and under the financial ones, it actually has that for you. Or you can just use the equal signs, open parentheses, and then you can specify those parameters in here. These are just the simple parameters that you can do. MATLAB, which is a program I use a lot, even MATLAB has gotten into the game of financial analysis, and you can actually do some basic financial analysis in MATLAB. So let's look at present value function with and without. So this is inflation. Oh, this is without inflation, our present value function. Now we're going to go ahead and inflate it. And so what we have to do is anytime we see our 1 here, we have to add an E, right? Because we have to get that much more of an investment to get our effective inflation. So we're just replacing 1 in our numerators and with 1 plus E. So we do a little bit of fancy-dancy math. And instead of calling it D now, we're going to update our discount rate to include the effect of inflation, and we're going to denote it D prime. And so our 1 plus E over 1 plus D is going to be equivalent to 1 over 1 plus D prime, and we're going to solve that for our modified discount rate, which if you notice, right, if we have a 10% interest rate and we ignore the effect of inflation and get 10%, this tells you here that our D prime is always going to be less than, whoops, I did that the other way. Our D prime will always be less than our unescalated discount rate. So the effect of adding inflation or escalation is to reduce the discount rate. It makes it lower. It makes it less of a good bargain, which makes sense, right? When we talked about getting 8%, you have to reduce the effect of inflation by the 2.65. And so I did it simply, but this one actually shows you the actual calculation to figure out what the effective rate is. So here's an example. What's the net present value of a premium motor that initially costs $500 more than a comparable, less efficient unit, but it saves us $192 per year? And that's going to be for the next 20 years, so the motor's going to last for 20 years. The interest rate we're going to be experiencing is 10%, but our inflation is also going to be 5%. So essentially, what's going to happen is it's going to knock down that value. Okay? And how much does it knock it down? Right here. 5% inflation does, from a 10% interest rate does not take it down to 5%. It actually takes it down to lower than that. So we're going to get 4.76%. And our present value function, so that's when we're going to figure out how many years. So if we did our value for our annuity and we actually calculate what our present value function is, it's 12.7 years. So our net present value is our $192 per year saving, multiplied by our present value function, subtracting from that the initial investment that we're going to make, and our net present value is $1,942. So we're actually going to save $1,942 if we include the effect of inflation, as compared to $1,135 without inflation. So that shows you what the actual savings will be, which is an extra $800 over the 20-year lifespan for that. This one is really helpful, right? If you get confused, always go ahead and do your units, right? You'll notice $192 per year times the number of years. When you multiply that out, that becomes dollars. And so $500 is just dollars, so you can actually compare things in terms of our unit conversions. So we can also expand that to do cash flows incorporating inflation. And don't forget, our W here is inflation-free, our inflation-free annuity value, and our D prime, whoops, is the inflation-adjusted value, okay? So we can either compare the two by using this equation, and again, our A is our inflated adjusted one, which is here, or we can just put it in one equation and just use our inflation-free value and then just update our D prime, our discount rate with D prime. So let's calculate the internal rate of return or determine the internal rate of return for an HVAC retrofit. So fairly large consumption. We're going to go from 2.3 gigawatts to 0.8 gigawatt hours of power consumption. So we're going to reduce the power demand by almost a third. But in addition, we're also going to reduce the demand by 150 kilowatts. So remember we talked about large commercial customers actually get hit with demand payments. So if we can reduce our demand costs, right, we can save quite a bit of money there. So our electricity costs are about $60 a megawatt hour, and that's pretty stable. I mean, it depends a little bit where you are in the country, but if you were to go to ISO New England's website and look at real-time energy costs, they vary a little bit. Summertime, it's much different, but using a $60 per megawatt hour is a reasonable number in today's day and age. So we have electricity costs $60 per megawatt hour. Demand charges are $7,000 a month per megawatt demand. And they're going to escalate, right? So not inflate, but escalate. So that's based on a number of different factors than just, you know, it's more expensive to produce things. Our escalation rate is 5%. We're going to have to spend $500,000 today, and it's going to last for 15 years. So we want to determine what is the internal rate of return. So the first thing we need to do is figure out what the what the savings are going to be as a result of this implementation. So we're going to save 1.5 gigawatt hours per year, which equates to $90,000 when we multiply our costs. Our demand charges are going to be reduced because it's $7,000 per megawatt per month. So we reduce our demand by 150 kilowatts. So 150 kilowatt reduction times $7,000 per megawatt per month times 12 months says that I save an additional $12,600 a year. So the total savings I get is $102,600 per year as a result of this. Now, let's go ahead and do the IRR. That gives us a net present value of 0, because that's what we're doing, right? Whatever this equation evaluates to, that tells us so that evaluates so that it matches our $500,000 is going to be 0, okay? So the net present value, so that it's a zero-sum game. So when I take my $500,000, divide it by my annuity, I get 4.873. I go back to my table, and I look at a period for 15 years, and I look at a value of 4.873, and I get an interest rate of 19%. Now we're going to add inflation. So we want to actually go and calculate what the base value is, not what our D prime value is. So our 19% is what it's going to do, including escalation. Now we're going to back out what the actual discount rate is. So we have our 5% escalation, our 19% inflated adjusted discount rate. We multiply those out, and we end up with a discount rate of 25%. Another approach, which would have been the same one, is to just use your IRR at 0. So what is the internal rate of return at 0? And then just include the effects of inflation, not including the time in there. Okay? So if you do include inflation, it's usually much better to do your cash flow analysis and all your financial analyses to do it in the present as opposed to the future. And most financial analyses I've seen are always looking at present value because I can make an assessment today. I know what a $2.3 million outlay is. I may not have the same appreciation for $2.3 million in 5 or 10 years. So doing everything with today's money gets that inflation out of there, right? You don't have to include the fact that, okay, well, what does $2.3 million look like? So it's much, much easier to do it with today just because of our interpretation. The other thing is, if you have inflation that's always greater than 0, right, which is almost always the case, you're going to get a decline in cash flows. Your value of your money is going to be less. So this is just sort of annualizing our investment and figuring out, well, do we invest or do we not invest? Because why do we outlay capital? Why do we put money out? It's a couple reasons, right? First reason is we want a good or service that we don't currently have, and we want to do, we want a new car, we want a new cell phone, we want to take a trip to wherever. You know, that'd be a good or service that we're willing to pay for to do that. Another capital outlay, right, would be maybe you want to do something for charitable reasons. You want to add to humanity or improve humanity. Another reason, which is what business operates on, is I'm investing. Okay? When you get hired on for company XYZ, they are looking at you as an investment. The idea is that you are going to bring in more money than you cost. Okay? Even if it's a government position or nonprofit, there is the thought that if you don't bring in more money than you cost, then it's just not going to be practical. Even nonprofits have to apply for funding, for support. I mean, there's just a bunch of different things that need to be done. So it sounds harsh, and it's not intended to be, but and the reality of it is that just about any business decision is going to be made based on, you know, is this going to increase income or cash flow, improve cash flow. So we're looking at as investment as a loan. Doesn't have to be an official loan, but when you invest in the stock market, it is a loan technically, right? You're buying, well, it's not technically a loan. It's sort of a loan in that you're buying a stock in a company, but the expectation is you're going to sell that stock at some point. And if you get into the stock market, you actually can borrow shares. That's called shorting a stock or longing a stock if you think it's going to go up or down. Those are stocks that you don't actually technically own. Those are borrowed stocks. And it adds a lot of movement in the market. If you really want to get into some risky stuff, there's penny stocks, but doing longing and shorting is really kind of an interesting thing to do. So we're going to go back to our present value function, and we're just going to rewrite this equation and solve it for A. And that, again, is back to our capital recovery. The only difference is the inverse of our present value function is our capital recovery function. It's just the inverse of it. All right? And essentially what happens when you do our capital recovery, remember our present value is going to be units of dollars. Our annuity is going to be in dollars per year, right? So the capital recovery factor has to have the units of 1 over year. That's why it tells you the speed, right? How long it takes for you to recover your initial investment. It's 1 over years. Again, it's also, here's the function in Excel. There wasn't one in MATLAB, but you can write a script file pretty efficiently. So let's look at an efficient air conditioner or HVAC unit. We want to improve the efficiency of an air conditioner. It's going to cost $1,000 up front. It's going to save us $200 a year, so sort of from the previous example we had, but now we're looking at 10-year loan, and it's going to be repaid at a 7% interest. So we want to figure out how much our annual savings are going to be once we include the fact that we have to pay off that initial $1,000. So we're going to take our $1,000 that we had to purchase it and multiply it by our capital recovery factor. So to pay back that $1,000 for the next 10 years at a 7% interest rate, we need $142.38 to do that. The savings, hopefully, will cover the initial $1,000 expense. Otherwise, it would not be worthwhile to do an efficiency improvement, because unless you were trying to actually save energy for the good of the environment, right? If you're just trying to save energy for the fact of cost savings, your annual savings of $200 a year had better be greater than what your capital recovery factor is. And in this case, it is. So you actually save $57.62. Your benefits to cost ratio, 1.4. You always want that number to be above 1. Should have higher benefits. Here's another example. 3 kilowatt PV system with a capacity factor of 25 or 0.25. It costs $10,000 up front. You're going to pay it back with a 20-year, 6% loan. We would like to figure out, and this is a much more useful one to tell us, dollars per kilowatt hour. Because if you're going to be putting a PV system on your house, most of the way that you're going to get paid or pay back on that is you're going to defer your own electricity use. Okay? So if you can produce power at a cheaper rate than you can buy it from the grid, then it's a worthwhile investment, right? As long as you can pay back the $10,000. If you don't generate enough electricity, and it still doesn't, it's not going to make enough sense for you to pay that $10,000 back. But at the very least, you should be able to beat 18 cents a kilowatt hour. So we're going to figure out how much it takes per year to pay back that $10,000 loan over a 20-year 6% interest rate. We need $872 to do that. We're going to generate 6,600 kilowatt hours per year. So the cost of us producing electricity, no maintenance on this system, right? We're assuming that no maintenance is being done. It's going to save us $872 a year in energy that $872 is what it's going to cost us to pay it back, but it's going to save us nearly 6,600 kilowatt hours per year. So this is 13.3 cents per kilowatt hour, which is improving by 5 cents, right? You're better than 5 cents for the going rates. And electricity rates are anticipated to go up, not down. So this would be a decision where you probably would do it, again, as long as you can get $10,000 a year, which is apparently, or $10,000 over 20 years, which is apparently something that's achievable. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is, do you have a PV system on your house? What happens when the lights go out on the grid? You still have lights? Answer is, anybody want to guess, yes or no? You get a PV, it's bright sun, beautiful day. You don't know why the utility kicked off, but the utility kicked off. Are your lights still on?
Don't you actually need a special setup to be able to do that, to use your own system when the grid is out?
Well, the question is, do you need your own special setup? And I'm not sure if that's what you're getting at, but you have a PV array, right, that takes DC, and there's an inverter that converts it to AC. Your house runs on AC. So as long as the sun's bright and shining, and you are less than 3 kilowatts of energy consumption, will the light stay on once the grid goes away? The answer is no, because the utility will not allow you to interconnect unless you have an IEEE 1547 compliant system, which basically means you will not feed power back to the grid if the lights on the grid are off. And the reason being is it's not as obvious or intuitive. What if you're an electrical line worker and there's a problem on the line on your street? You expect the line to be de-energized, right? Because you've been told to go out and fix the line, it's de-energized. You go out there and you start working on the line, and somebody's PV system is cranking out kilowatts, and it's back feeding from that house, going through the breaker panel, up into the transformer that's at 240 volts, stepping it up to 7,200 volts, the line is energized at 7,200 volts. So now the utility company has lost control of the line and it's energized that way. Now, that's a little bit of a misnomer because if your PV system is on the line and it's 7,200 volts going there, well, your neighbor is going to try to take power away and it's going to just basically pull the voltage down in the system that it probably would trip on overcurrent anyway. But it's not a guarantee of that. So if the voltage is gone or if it's bad, it'll go away with it. And most of the inverters, the way they work, they're constantly trying to adjust the frequency. It's supposed to be at 60 hertz. They're trying to increase it or decrease it a little bit. If it's allowed to increase it or decrease, that means the utility is gone because you cannot change the frequency if the utility is there. So by increasing it or decreasing it, that says, well, the utility kicked off. So the moment you increase or decrease the frequency, then it opens up. And once you open up, you can no longer produce power, even for your home. You have to kick offline. Okay? There are different configurations that, yes, you can work with DC systems, and you can have inverters that don't necessarily rely on the grid, but you cannot interconnect to the grid. And believe it or not, it's by far the most efficient, most reliable, most cost-effective, you're going to hate to say that, way to get 24/7 power is from the grid, not from your PV system. So that's why people who have camps, one of the things that makes a camp very viable is there a utility line that runs out to it. Having no utility line, even with solar for lights and all that stuff, is a very different experience than actually having a utility line that goes to a camp. So just a little bit. If you want to learn more about distributed generation and interconnection, reading about IEEE 1547 is a really good thing. And actually, as a University of Maine student, you all have free access to the IEEE library. So if you go to library indexes and databases, IEEE, just search for IEEE 1547. There was a new edition that came out in 2018 that talks about some of the testing and all the criteria that these systems have to meet to be able to do that. So I think the final discussion before we get into SAM is levelized bus bar. So we're going to include inflation and fuel costs and all that stuff to figure out dollars per kilowatt hour. So you have to include inflation, your capital recovery factor, and any operating costs to maintain your plant. So you bring everything to the present time, so you present worth everything. You do an equivalent annual, so you basically will solve for your inflated adjusted discount rate. Then you also figure out your yearly generation to figure out your total kilowatt hours per year. And then you just divide that ratio, the amount of kilowatt hours you're producing, the dollars it costs, by the kilowatt hours, and now you have $8 per kilowatt for your levelized bus bar. So here's how you adjust your annual costs with your discount rate, your inflated adjusted discount rate. Then you're going to multiply your annual costs by your capital recovery factor. And this is what are going to do is our annualized costs. You can include a levelizing factor here, which essentially talks about if your present value function and your capital recovery factor equal 1, that means you essentially have no inflation. So here's an example. Microturbines, I believe Professor Dvorak has talked about that. Those were popular for a while. They're less popular, but they are running at very high rates of speed, very compact units, burning natural gas and getting lots and lots of heat. That's considered distributed generation, not necessarily renewable, because a lot of those are burning natural gas. Now, if you do get the gas source from a landfill, that would be considered an alternative, perhaps, energy source. But let's look at a microturbine. It costs about $850 per kilowatt of nameplate to buy a microturbine. Your heat rate, if you recall what heat rate is essentially a way of saying efficiency. This is a simple cycle setup, right? So a heat rate of 12,500 is pretty good, but not great. It runs about 70% of the time at full out, right? Because you have a fuel source. You don't rely on the wind or the sun to provide your energy source. So you have a pretty good capacity factor. You do have to do some maintenance, but not too much. Also, you might want to have your microturbine oversized for the load so that depending on how the load varies, you might be able to pick up additional load. I'm not exactly sure what happened to the printing, but fuel costs should be 4 times 10 to the 6 dollars per BTU. I don't know why that kind of got a little weird like that, but it's $4, 4 times 10 to the 6 is the dollars per BTU. Our escalation costs are 6%, and our variable O&M costs is about, again, this is a nameplate number, so we can make the calculations easier. So it's 0.2 cents per kilowatt hour. Our discount rate is 10%. We have a fixed charge rate to pay back this facility at 12%, and it's going to last for 20 years. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and figure out what our levelized fixed costs are. So at $850 per kilowatt, paying back at 12%, it runs 8760 hours, and it's at 70% of those time. So just for that, it's going to be 1.66 cents per kilowatt hour is what the costs are. That's just for the fixed costs. The next cost we have to include is operating it. So now we're going to include fuel and O&M. So per annum, we're going to use $4 per MMBTU. And our heat rate is 12,500 plus the O&M cost of 0.2 cents per kilowatt hour gives us 5.2 cents per kilowatt hour for energy production. Now we're going to levelize by including our present value function with the discount rate and our capital recovery factor without the adjusted discount rate. And we first need to calculate what our D prime is. So that is here. So we went from 6% with our inflated adjusted discount rate, or our escalated discount rate goes down to 3.77%. And when we multiply our present value function with that specific rate and our capital recovery with our 10%, we end up with 1.628. And this just sort of shows you where it levelizes the cost. This is the costs are increasing in time, but we're trying to make everything a nice, flat, even for comparison purposes. So that's all we're trying to do there. So continuing on, we're going to add our costs, including our levelizing factor, which is 1.628, and we end up with 8.4 cents per kilowatt hour. So we're going to add our fixed costs and our variable costs together, and this microturbine produces energy at 10.13 cents per kilowatt hour, which is not bad. So that's it for calculations. This is the last little bit, and this is something I got to spend some time with this summer. This is NREL's System Advisor Model, which is a free download, and it allows you, again, to do financial analysis on a number of different projects. If you look closely here, I didn't highlight these for a reason. You can see there's photovoltaic, battery storage, wind, concentrating solar power, solar water heating, biomass, and geothermal. So depending on the renewable or alternative energy product or project you want to pursue, you can actually run some analysis, and it'll give you some pretty reasonable resource calculations based on location. So for example, I was looking at a project, just sort of a fun project to see what it would be on campus to put a 2 megawatt PV array on campus someplace. You can actually specify a location, and it pulls data from the NREL database based on the solar insolation data, and it'll tell you how many megawatt or kilowatt hours you would be expected to produce based on month. So it actually will spit out that data for you. And depending on the, if that's photovoltaic, you can do wind. Battery storage is massive. There's tremendous amount of work going on in New York and Texas, huge storage projects, and a lot of that has to do with distributed generation. But you can look at some of the economics of battery storage, and there's a company, I can't recall the name of the company on the top of my head, but literally they just sit there and do real-time pricing, and they estimate based on what the load is, what the weather looks like, is the wind blowing, is it not, and they can actually tell you if you are a battery storage facility, start charging or start discharging at basically on a real-time data. So they'll get real-time information and it'll charge or discharge, and they make money. They can make a lot of money actually just based on that. So these are huge facilities. They come in, basically they come in containerized trucks. So if you were to look at them, it's an interesting look, but it's basically a shipping container that you'd see on a boat. They're pretty standardized, and you have doors that you can swing open, and then you can access the battery racks. And so literally they just have stacks of batteries on top of each other, and those are the cells. So you can access them. You need lots of cooling, because if it gets hot inside there, the batteries will degrade very quickly. So they have big cooling units. And at one end of the container structure is a controller to help manage and maintain, kind of control and monitor the batteries to figure out what's going on. There's been quite a bit of research, and if I can have time, I'll try to add some information on battery storage and some of the stuff that I've been looking at. But down here, because we're talking about financial, it actually tells you, you can click on financial models. So is it residential, commercial? Is it third-party ownership? Is it going to be a purchase power agreement? I can't remember what the LCOE represents. But these will tell you whether you want to do a home PV project or do you want to have a project that is, a much larger scale project. Because one of the things that are for sale is the assets, the taxes, the renewable energy credits. A lot of these things are moving along so they can make these projects look a lot more viable based on selling the equities and doing a lot of these things. And so this financial package can do a lot of that for you. So here is some of the stuff that I did some additional detail in. You can take a look. And there's some papers in here, but I just clicked on LCE, which is basically, that's why I can't remember, it's not the levelized bus bar, but it actually, oh, here it is, levelized cost of energy. That's the term they use. I apologize, I just did not remember that off the top of my head. But all the calculations that they're doing in SAM are what we do, right? You have a capital cost, a fixed operating cost, a variable operating cost, annual fixed charge rate. These are all the costs we just looked at, and it's all exactly implemented in SAM. So if you wanted to go ahead and do your own analysis, you can do that in SAM pretty effectively. So that is my last slide. So thank you very much. There should be a quiz that is available. We will pick up wind energy on Tuesday. Have a great weekend. Thank you.